On July 17, 1970, during the middle of the night, 5 convicts, all serving life sentences, escaped from Huntsville Penitentiary in Texas. Convicts were Mark Lewis, age 27, James Turner, age 32, Paul Davidson, age 36, Richard Cole, age 29, and Henry Mitchell, age 41. While making their escape, they stumbled upon an abandoned ranch, or so they thought, about 15 miles away from the penitentiary. 2 days later, 2 of the convicts told the authorities the grisly details of what happened to them at that ranch. This is a story as told by one of the convicts, Mark Lewis. Me and the boys had been planning our escape for months. Our plan was to make it down to Mexico, where no one would know who we were. We knew we had to get as far away from here as possible. We made our escape in the middle of the night, about 2 a.m. I think. Once making it past the walls, we started running south and planned to turn west once we made it past the Trinity River. I'm not sure how far we ran or for how long, but the sun was rising as a ranch came into view. We were tired, hungry, and thirsty, and figured we'd run far enough away that we could take a break for a while. When we got close to the ranch, I could see it looked old and decaying, like it hadn't been used in years. The house looked dirty, and the bushes surrounding the house were overgrown. The barn looked like it was going to crumble in on itself. We weren't sure if anyone still lived there, so we approached the house slowly and carefully. As we got within a few meters of the house, we decided 3 of us would go to the back door, in case people in the house decided to try and run out the back. And the other 2 would knock on the front door to see if anyone was home. If there were people there, our plan was to tie them up so we could get something to eat and drink before we continued running. I went to the back door with 2 of the other boys and stood there waiting to see if anyone came running out the door. A few minutes went by when the door suddenly opened, and it was James. He said there was no one in the house, so the rest of us went inside so we could start looking for some food and something to drink. The inside of the house was as bad as the outside. It was filthy and smelled musty. It looked like some wild animals had been living there for some time. We hunted around for some food, and all we could find were several cans of meat and beans. The faucet inside the house didn't work, so James told Paul to go outside to see if there was a well nearby. 10 minutes went by before we heard Paul yelling, "Get out here now." We all took off running out the back door. Once outside, we heard Paul again, "I'm in the barn. Get in here now." As we ran towards the barn, we could see the barn doors were slightly open. Before going inside, we paused for a moment, looking at each other, not knowing what to expect. We were already jittery and on edge. I was the first one inside the barn, which was somewhat dark. As I stepped inside and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see Paul in front of me with a strange look on his face. I then happened to notice, out of the corner of my eye, what appeared to be a man a couple of meters away from Paul. I looked over in his direction and could see it was, in fact, a man. He was standing there, staring at me. He had long silver hair that went past his shoulders and looked to be about 60 years of age. As the rest of the boys came in behind me, they stopped dead in their tracks as well when they saw the man. We stood there looking at both Paul and the man for a bit, or James spoke up and asked, "Who are you, old man? Do you live here?" The man didn't answer. He just continued staring at me without uttering a word. A minute went by before James again asked the man who he was and if he lived there, this time more sternly. James was always a hothead, and I knew if he didn't answer soon, it could spell trouble for the man. Another minute went by before the old man slowly turned his head, so he was now looking at James and responded in a calm, confident voice. "I do live here, and have for a long time." I noticed the old man had a slight accent that I couldn't quite place at the moment. James then said, "Paul, Richard, grab that chair over there and find some rope to tie up the old man." They both knew James's temper well, so they wasted no time in grabbing a chair that was nearby and finding some baling twine. As they grabbed and tied the old man to the chair, he didn't fight back or say anything. He continued staring at James with an expressionless look on his face. It was an ache that went through me. Something was not right about this man. My father murdered my mother when I was 14 and was a fiend to me and my siblings, so spotting evil had become second nature to me. Kept my thoughts to myself. Showing weakness in front of the boys was not something I was going to do. James then instructed Paul to go grab the canned food we'd found in the house and asked him if he'd found a well with water in it, which Paul replied he had. As Paul left, James turned his gaze towards the old man and asked, "What's your story, old man? How do you live in a hellhole like that?" The old man didn't respond at first. He just sat there glaring at James. When he finally spoke, he said, "Let me tell you, gentlemen, a story, since it looks like I might be here for a spell. I was born a very long time ago in Lyon, France. When I was a young man, about your age I suspect, something terrible happened to me. It has led me to be unable to die. Since I no longer fear death, I long for it. Each day that passes is one more day I must remain on this God-forsaken earth. Judging by your attire, gentlemen, I can see where you came from. I do not care what your business is or what plans you have. I only ask you leave before nightfall. Right then, Paul startled us as he walked in with the canned food and a bucket of water. We all jumped a little, and James made light of the situation, saying, "Crazy old man. Paul, bring me the food and water." What the old man said and the way he said it frightened me. This was not the way a crazy person talks or behaves. I looked over at the old man, who then lowered his head and was quiet. We then went and sat down in an area of the barn that was light enough for us to see when we ate. As we sat, we passed around the cans of food, sharing what little we had. The rest of the boys made light-hearted conversation about what their plans were when we made it to Mexico. But I couldn't shake the unnerving feeling this old man was dangerous. After we finished eating, James said, "Someone needs to go take first watch on the loft. The area surrounding us is wide open for several kilometers, so it would be best to travel by night, so we don't get spotted." We crossed several rivers on the way here, and went upstream a ways before going back on land, so it should take the dogs a while to find our scent. Richard then said he'd take first watch, as the rest of us went to different parts of the barn to try and get comfortable, so we could get some sleep. The next thing I remember was being awakened by Henry shaking me, saying it was my turn to watch, as he had just finished, which meant I'd been asleep for several hours. As I made my way to the ladder that went to the loft, I looked over at the old man. He was glaring at me again, with an expressionless look on his face. He didn't seem to be at all worried. 5 escaped convicts had tied him to a chair with no idea of what could happen next. When I made it to the loft and looked outside through one of the windows, I could see it was getting to be late afternoon, which meant we'd be leaving in a few hours. I wondered what James had in mind for the old man before we left. I sat down on a barrel the other boys had been using to watch from, and drifted off into my thoughts when suddenly I startled myself awake as I'd fallen asleep. I jumped off the barrel and noticed it was almost dusk. I hurried down the ladder to see if the boys were still asleep. They had to be. Otherwise, they'd have woken me up by now for sure. As I got down off the ladder and looked in the old man's direction, couldn't believe what I saw. He was just gone. I ran over to the chair to check and could see the baling twine we'd used to tie him up was ripped to shreds lying on the ground. I yelled to the boys to wake up and come quick. Within seconds, they all came running over to my side and were as unnerved as I was. Paul and Richard had tied him up well, and he didn't look strong enough to rip through the baling twine. The barn was quickly getting dark inside, so I asked James what we should do now, when suddenly we heard a noise coming from one of the rooms in the back of the barn. Henry spoke up and said, "James, let's get out of here. It's hard to see in here, and we need to leave anyway. I'm not leaving without giving the old man a proper goodbye. Do you know what I mean? He knows we're escaped convicts. That's got to be him back there in one of those rooms. If you guys are too scared to go back there to get him with me, then just wait here," said James. "Fine, but hurry the hell up," I responded. James started slowly walking to the back of the barn. There were at least 3 rooms in the back, and several stables. James always acted like a tough guy, but deep down I thought he was a coward. 4 of us watched as James disappeared into the darkness. It was getting hard to see in the barn, except for a sliver of moonlight from the rising moon that was starting to come down through the cracks in the old wood. At that point, I was sweating and shaking so badly with fear, I thought I might pass out, when suddenly I heard something let out a growl as James screamed out, "You son of a..." Then he was cut off. The 4 of us wasted no time in moving to get the hell out of there. We turned and ran towards the barn doors, which were a few meters behind us. When we hit the doors and tried pushing them open, they wouldn't open. We fumbled around for a bit, trying to figure out why we couldn't open the doors when we found out why. Someone had put a chain through the doors with a padlock on it, locking us in. "Oh hell, what are we gonna do now?" asked Richard. "Find a way out. Come on, we need to get out of here now. Let's see if we can find somewhere we can squeeze through," I responded. We started feeling our way along the barn wall, trying to see if we could find an opening when I heard what sounded like another growl, then something on 4 legs running fast towards us. I shouted out, "What is that?" Suddenly, and without warning, all let out a blood-curdling scream and cried out, "Help! Something's got me." He continued screaming, and suddenly it was as if something ripped out his throat, and the screaming immediately stopped. Henry then yelled, "Come on, Mark, let's get the hell out of here now." I didn't say anything. I just started to run away from Paul's screams as fast as I could. As I ran through that dark barn, I kept running into things, almost knocking myself out several times. When I came to what I thought was the back of the barn, I turned around and stood there trying to catch my breath. As I stood there, I noticed it was dead silent. Nothing was moving or making noise. It was as if the world had come to a halt. A few minutes went by when I heard someone whisper, "Mark, is that you?" "It's me, James. I think I found a way out of here. Come here." I immediately stiffened up and froze. I thought to myself, I heard James scream something awful. Could he still be alive? Then again, I heard someone whispering from the dark, "Come on, Mark, get over here." I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I didn't want to stand there waiting to be next. I slowly started creeping towards the sound of James' voice when I heard Henry's blood-curdling screams coming from the loft area. I started moving faster towards James's voice when suddenly I stumbled upon something lying on the floor. It made a grunting sound, which made me jump back. "Mark, it's me, James. Help me up." I reached down to help James up when my hand touched a pool of warm liquid on the ground. I put my hand up to my nose, could smell the distinct smell of blood. I fumbled around a bit more until I found James's arm and helped him up, off the barn floor. It was then I noticed the light from the moon coming in and could see the way out James had said he'd found. We hurried as fast as we could, being that James was tore up badly and bleeding. When we got to the hole, the light was coming through. I pushed on the barn's paneling, and it opened up just enough that we could fit through. Once outside, we started heading back the way we'd come. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder as I helped James along, thinking we were for sure next. We continued walking all night to try and get as far away from the ranch as possible. When it got light enough, we found a busy road to try and get some help. It didn't take long for people to figure out we were escaped convicts, and we were picked up by the police. I thought James was going to die sometime during the night, but the tough bastard held on. After Mark Lewis told his story to the warden let the local police know, who then went to investigate the ranch. When they went inside the barn, several of the men said it smelled like an animal's den. While searching the barn, they found the old man on the loft, sitting in a chair, reading a book. When asked who he was, his response was, "What took you so long?" He was placed under arrest for the suspected murders of Paul Davidson, Richard Cole, and Henry Mitchell. As they searched the barn further, they found a hidden room under one of the rooms that contained the bones of several dozen people, including Paul and Henry. The bones had been picked clean, except for some fairly fresh tissue that still covered them. Over the next month, a search of the entire premises was conducted. There was never an exact count of how many bodies they found, but they suspect as many as 100 different bodies may have been found on the ranch. Richard's body or bones were never recovered. They searched the house as well, finding many old items, some dating back to the 1700s. An old photograph that matched the old man was found. Experts say the photograph dates back to the 1850s and was taken in France. No one knows how or when the old man came to live on the ranch, as it had been abandoned for 30 years. The old man was sentenced to prison, and there he stayed until 1984. One day in the summer of 1984, he vanished. It's thought he escaped. A search was organized, but he was never found. Another family who purchased the land the ranch was on has said over the years they'll sometimes see a strange older man walking around the outskirts of the ranch, sometimes just standing there staring, then walking back into the trees. The old man would never give his name to the authorities, so his nickname became the Old Man. When the warden asked the old man if the story Mark Lewis told was true, the old man's response was, "I don't deny it." James survived his injuries but needed to have his left arm amputated due to the severe damage it suffered. His story correlates with Mark's story. When the warden asked Mark Lewis what he thought killed the other men, Mark's response was, "A werewolf." For more chilling horror stories, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.